The bar smelled like stale synthale and ozone. A perfume Jedediah Riggs knew better than the memory of his wife's face. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the little bubbles die against the side. Port Nowhere was a pit stop, a rusty hub of girders and recycled air spinning in the black between systems. And it was the closest thing Jed had to a home. He was a long-haul freighter pilot. Home was a place you left. The news was on the big screen over the bar. The volume low. Just a murmur under the clinking glasses and tired conversations. A Twi'lek announcer with cosmetic antennae was talking about trade disputes in the Orion Spur. The usual garbage. Jed took a long drink. The ale was thin and chemical tasting, but it was wet and it was cold. It was enough. Then the Tevlek's face changed. Her professional calm shattered, replaced by a confusion that bled into raw panic. Her voice, suddenly loud as the bartender fumbled with the remote, cracked. We are getting confirmation. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. A collective hush fell over the bar. Every eye, human and alien, lifted to the screen. On it, a star chart shimmered, a familiar one. The Kepler -186 system. 5 planets, 2 of them cradling life. Billions of souls, a beacon of galactic colonization. The Kepler -186 system, the announcer stammered, her voice a fragile thing. We have lost contact. Not just contact, the system is gone. The star chart flickered. A live feed from the Fargaze array took its place. It showed a patch of deep space, an empty patch, where a bright yellow dwarf star and its family of planets should have been. There was nothing, just the cold, indifferent sprinkle of more distant galaxies. No flare, no supernova remnant, no debris field. It was as if someone had taken a cosmic eraser and simply wiped it away. A glass shattered on the floor. Someone choked back a sob. Jed felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the cheap ale. Billions of people, gone, not dead in a war or a plague. Just deleted. It was a violation of physics, a violation of reason. The feed on the screen dissolved into static. For a full 10 seconds, the entire bar, maybe the entire galaxy, held its breath, listening to the hiss of an empty channel. Then, out of the static, a single sentence formed on the screen. The letters were stark white against the black. They weren't in any known language, yet everyone who saw them understood them in their own native tongue. For Jed, they appeared as plain, terrifying English. A star for us all. The message hung there for a moment, then the screen went black. The silence in the bar was deeper and more absolute than the void where Kepler -186 used to be. The bartender, a burly man with a chrome arm, stood frozen, his hand still on the volume control. Jed looked down at his own hands. They were trembling. The galaxy had known war, famine, and disaster. But it had never known this. It had never known a miracle of pure evil. And it had never, not once, in its long and bloody history, believed in the grim fairy tale of human sacrifice. Until now. The next cycle was a blur of panic and official denial. The Galactic Concordance, the bloated government body that kept the peace, issued a statement. They called it a sensor malfunction of unprecedented scale, a gravitational anomaly, a natural, though poorly understood phenomenon. They used a lot of big words that meant nothing. Nobody was buying it. You don't misplace a star system like you. Misplace your ship keys. The message, A star for a soul was dismissed as a cruel prank, a hack by some terror group looking to capitalize on the confusion. But the story spread. It traveled through the subspace comms channels like a virus. It whispered from the speakers of freighters like Jed's and screamed from the news feeds on pristine core worlds. Jed tried to put it out of his mind. He had a haul to prep, a shipment of cryo-cooled selenium destined for the Rigel sector. He went down to the docking bay where his ship, the Sarah Jane, was clamped. He named it after his wife. A stupid, sentimental thing to do, but it was his. The ship was old, scarred from 1,000 minor impacts with space dust, the paint peeling around the thruster housings. It was his castle and his prison. His mechanic, Finn, was already there, running a diagnostic on the primary drive. Finn was a small, wiry man, whose face was a permanent roadmap of grease stains. He was the most rational person Jed had ever met. "You hear the news?" Jed asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous bay. Finn didn't look up from his datapad. "I hear the Concordance spouting nonsense, and I hear a bunch of scared spacers spreading ghost stories. A star doesn't just vanish, Jed. T here is a reason. We just don't know it yet. And the message." Finn finally looked at him, his eyes clear and sharp. "Someone's sick joke, that's all. Give it a week. They'll find a busted telescope or a cloud of dark matter, and everyone will feel stupid for panicking." Jed wanted to believe him. He truly did. But the image of that empty patch of sky was burned into his mind. He spent the rest of the day going through his pre-flight checks, the familiar routine a comfort. He checked the life support, calibrated the nav computer, inspected the cargo seals. It was work. It was normal. But the normality felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark ocean. That night, back in his sterile little room at the station's transient hotel, he saw it again. Not on the news, but scrawled on the wall of the corridor. Someone had used a protein bar to write the words in sticky brown letters. A star for a soul. The station maintenance bots had already been dispatched to clean it, their little scrubbers whirring away at the obscene message. Later, as he tried to sleep, the message came through his personal comlink. It wasn't a text or a voice call. It was just a single silent packet of data that opened an image file. Stark white letters on a black background. He deleted it, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was a ghost story, just like Finn said, but this ghost was learning how to get inside the house. The galaxy was a big, lonely place, full of things that science had yet to explain. But this felt different. This felt ancient. And it felt hungry. Jed pulled the thin blanket up to his chin, but the cold wasn't on his skin. It was inside him. A shard of ice lodged deep in his gut, right next to the memory of his wife and the empty space she had left behind. The idea, insane as it was, began to take root in the cracks of galactic society. On Port Nowhere, it started in a quiet corner of the main concourse. A makeshift shrine appeared overnight. It was just a few datapads set up on a crate, cycling through images of the missing Kepler, -180 planets. A picture of a smiling family on a green hillside. A shot of a gleaming alien city at dusk. In front of the crate, someone had placed a single withered flower. The one who started it was a woman named Ilara. Jed had seen her around. She'd worked as a hydrotechnician on the station until the news hit. Her sister, her sister's husband, their 2 kids. They had all been on Kepler -186f. They'd moved there 2 years ago for a better life. Jed watched her from a distance. She wasn't a wild-eyed fanatic. She was just a woman hollowed out by grief. She would stand by the shrine for hours, her face pale and still, her eyes fixed on the images of her lost family. At first, people gave her a wide berth, their pity mixed with unease. Then, one by one, others joined her. A man whose cousin had been a geologist on 186 set, a young pilot whose first assignment had been a supply run to the system. They didn't talk much. They just stood there, a small congregation of the bereaved, united by an impossible loss. Their shared silence was more powerful than any sermon. It drew people in. The desperate, the scared, the ones who had nothing left to lose. They started talking. Quietly at first. What if it wasn't a prank? What if it was real? The concordants had no answers. The scientists were stumped. What was left but to consider the impossible? "It's a poison," Finn said one evening, wiping his hands on a rag as they sat in the empty ship's galley. "Fear is a poison, Jed, and it's spreading faster than the damn news." "They're just scared, Finn." "Scared people do stupid things," Finn countered, his voice hard. "First they build a shrine, then they start praying. What's next? They start looking for a soul to trade." Jed didn't have an answer. He saw the group every day. It was growing. Ilara was their unofficial leader. She spoke with a quiet, heartbreaking sincerity. She argued that the message wasn't a threat, but an offer. A chance. A terrible, monstrous chance, but a chance nonetheless. One cycle, Jed was passing the concourse when he saw Ilara talking to a small crowd. Her voice was soft, but carried a strange authority. "The concordance tells us to wait. The scientists tell us to be patient. But what if there isn't time? What if they're still out there somewhere? Not dead, but taken, waiting for us to be brave enough to pay the price." A cold dread washed over Jed. He saw the faces in the crowd. They were rapt. They were listening. They weren't just grieving anymore. They were hoping. And their hope was the most terrifying thing Jed had ever seen. It was a hope that required a sacrifice. He walked away, the sound of Ilara's voice following him. That night, he thought about his wife, Sarah. He remembered the day she got the diagnosis, the doctors with their sad eyes and useless words, the feeling of utter helplessness. He understood the desperation. He understood the desire to believe in anything, no matter how insane, that offered a sliver of a chance. That was the real poison. It wasn't the fear. It was the hope that grew out of it. A dark, twisted flower blooming on a grave. The dream came for Jed 3 nights after the shrine went up. It wasn't a normal dream of jumbled images and forgotten anxieties. It was sharp and clear and colder than the vacuum of space. He was floating, not in his ship, not in a suit. Just him in his worn ship jumpsuit, drifting in an endless black. There were no stars here, no nebulae. Just a profound and absolute emptiness that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He felt no need to breathe. He felt no fear, only a deep, penetrating cold that settled in his bones. He knew where he was. This was the space where Kepler -186 should have been. The silence was a physical presence. It was the sound of billions of voices that were no longer there to scream. Sarah? She was floating a few meters away, looking just as she had the last time he'd seen her, before the sickness had taken the light from her eyes. Her short brown hair framed a face that was etched into his memory. She was wearing the simple white dress she'd worn on their anniversary. The one he had told her made her look like an angel. "Jed," she said. Her voice was not a memory. It was real, echoing in the impossible silence. A wave of emotion so powerful, it felt like a physical blow hit him. Grief and love and a desperate clawing need. Sarah, he breathed, the name a prayer. He tried to move toward her, to push through the void, but his limbs wouldn't respond. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "So quiet." "Where are we?" "Sarah, what is this?" "This is the peace they offer," she said, gesturing to the emptiness around them. "An end to all the noise, an end to the pain." Her eyes, her lovely brown eyes, seemed to hold a shadow in their depths. Something that wasn't her. "They returned something to me, Jed. They returned the quiet." A cold spike of terror lanced through Jed, overriding the love, overriding the grief. That wasn't Sarah talking, not his Sarah. "Who?" he managed to ask, his voice a dry rasp. "Who are they?" Sarah's smile widened, but it was a dead thing, a mask. "The ones who listen, the ones who wait." Her voice changed, deepening, becoming a layered chorus of whispers that grated against his mind. It was the sound of grinding stone and rustling static. They took a star, a bright, loud star, and in return they could have a soul, a small, quiet soul. "No," Jed whispered. The image of his wife flickered, her face contorting. For a moment she looked like she was in agony. "It's a fair trade, Jedediah," the chorus of whispers said, using his full name. A name only his mother and Sarah had ever used. 1,000,000,000 lives for one, a star for a soul. All it takes is a gift, a single willing gift. The form of Sarah reached out a hand toward him. "Give them a gift, Jed. Bring me back. Bring them all back." Jed woke up with a shout, drenched in cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His small cabin was dark and silent. He was alone. But the feeling of the dream, the bone-deep cold, and the sound of that whispering chorus lingered. It had found him. It had looked inside his head, found his deepest sorrow and put it on like a suit. It had worn his wife's face, and it had asked him for a gift. The news came from a place called Oakhaven, a small agrarian colony on a moon orbiting a gas giant, in a system no one ever thought about. It was an isolated community, founded by idealists who wanted to live simple lives close to the land. They were the last people you would expect. The Concordance tried to suppress the story, but it was too late. Oakhaven's message, a raw, unedited video file, went viral. Jed watched it in a crowded comms lounge on Port Nowhere, the air thick with tension. The video showed a town square, a patch of brown dirt surrounded by simple, prefabricated buildings. The entire colony was gathered, their faces grim and determined under a sickly green sky. In the center of the square stood a man. He was old, his body stooped and frail, but his eyes were clear. He was a volunteer. His name was Thomas. The colony's leader, a woman with graying hair and a farmer's strong hand, spoke to the camera. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped a small daypad. "We are not murderers," she said. "We are believers. The Concordance has failed us. Science has failed us. We have only faith left." She looked at the old man. Thomas has lived a long life. He has seen his children grow and his grandchildren born. His body is failing him. He has chosen to make his final act a gift. For Kepler -186. For all of us. Thomas stepped forward. He smiled, a gentle, tired smile. "Do not be sad for me," he said, his voice thin but clear. "My time is done. If my passing can bring back a single child from that lost place, then it is a good death. He then took a small, simple blade from the leader and, with a final look at his community, drew it across his own throat. The act was quick, clean, and utterly horrific. The crowd did not cheer. They stood in absolute reverent silence as he fell. The video ended. The comms lounge was silent. Jed felt sick to his stomach. He looked around at the faces. He saw horror. Yes. But he also saw something else. A flicker of awful, desperate curiosity. For 3 days, the entire galaxy held its breath. People watched the sky, glued to the Fargaze array feeds, waiting for a star to reappear. They waited for a miracle. Nothing happened. The space where Kepler -186 used to be remained empty and black. The silence from the void was deafening. Then, on the 3rd day, a new message appeared. It manifested on every public screen, on every private comm, just like before. The same stark white letters, but this time, the message was different. Teach it was not a gift. It was a murder driven by fear. A gift must be given freely from a heart full of hope, not a mind full of despair. Try again. The backlash was instantaneous and violent. The people of Oakhaven were branded killers, lunatics. The Concordance sent ships to quarantine the moon. But the damage was done. The Whisper, as people were now calling the entity, had not just acknowledged the act. It had refined the rules. It had rejected their offering. It wasn't just about dying, it was about the why. It had to be a gift, a pure act. The horror of it deepened. This wasn't a simple transaction. It was a twisted theological test, and the proctor was an invisible monster that ate stars. And it was telling them they had failed. On Port Nowhere, Ilara's group didn't see it as a failure. They saw it as a clarification. They had been given a vital piece of information. They now knew what the Whisper wanted, not just a death. It wanted a true believer, a martyr. And their search for one began in earnest. Port Nowhere stopped feeling like a station and started feeling like a cage. The low-level hum of the life support systems seemed to carry a new paranoid frequency. People eyed each other in the corridors. Casual conversations died when a member of Ilara's group approached. They called themselves the Starbearers now. The group had changed. They were no longer just a collection of mourners. They had a purpose, a doctrine clarified by the Oakhaven tragedy. They preached on the concourse, their voices filled with a chilling mixture of piety and urgency. Ilara was their high priestess. Her personal grief now magnified into a galactic crusade. The people of Oakhaven acted out of fear, she would say, her eyes scanning the faces of the uneasy crowd. Their sacrifice was tainted. But we can be better. We can give a true gift, a gift of pure hope. One perfect soul to reclaim 1 billion. Finn was furious. They're a death cult, Jed. He spat one shift, slamming a wrench down on his workbench. Plain and simple, talking about pure hope. Here is no hope in this, only madness. He painted the wrench at Jed. And you've been quiet. Too quiet. That dream you told me about, it's eating you, isn't it? Jed didn't answer. Finn was right. The dream was a constant presence, a cold spot in the back of his mind. He saw Sarah's face in the reflections on viewport glass. He heard the sibilant whisper in the hiss of a hydraulic door. The whisper had tasted his grief, and it hadn't forgotten the flavor. He started avoiding the main concourse, taking the long way through service tunnels to get to his ship. But he couldn't avoid the atmosphere. The Starbearers were actively looking now. They weren't looking for a victim to murder. They were looking for a volunteer. The right kind of volunteer. Someone whose spirit was untainted by fear. They would approach people not with threats, but with soft voices and searching eyes. Is your heart heavy with loss, they'd ask. Do you wish to give your life meaning beyond its simple end? Most people recoiled, cursing them or hurrying away, but some listened. The lonely, the forgotten, the terminally ill. The station's medical bay reported that starbearers had been trying to speak with patients, offering them not a cure, but a glorious purpose. The station administrator, a harried man named Calloway, issued a decree forbidding their proselytizing. The starbearers ignored him. They saw him as another faithless bureaucrat, part of the system that had failed them. Their movement was fueled by a power greater than station regulations, the terror of an empty sky. One day, Jed saw Ilara talking to a young girl, no older than 10, who was crying because she had dropped her ice cream. Ilara knelt down, wiped the girl's tears and bought her a new one. She looked like a kind, compassionate woman. Then she looked up, and her eyes met Jed's from across the concourse. In them, he saw no kindness. He saw only a terrifying, absolute certainty. The certainty of a person who believes they are doing God's work. It was the most dangerous thing in the universe, and it was looking for a saint. They found him in the station's charity ward. His name was Cale. He was an old prospector, one of the thousands who had come to the outer systems chasing asteroid gold and ended up with nothing but lung sickness from bad life support filters. He was over 150 standard years old, his skin as thin and brittle as ancient paper, his breath a constant shallow wheeze. Jed and Finn heard about it from a nurse who worked in the ward. They're with him all the time, she said, her voice a hushed, worried whisper in the cantina. Ilara and her people, they bring him food. They read to him, they tell him he can be a hero. Cale had no family, no one to visit him. The starbearers had filled that void. They had given a lonely, dying man a community and a purpose. They had told him that his tired, failing body could be the key that unlocked a system full of life. To Kyle, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was a promotion. Finn and Jed went to the ward. They found Ilara sitting by Cale's bedside, reading from a datapad. The old man was propped up on his pillows, a beatific smile on his face. He looked happier than Jed had ever seen anyone in this station. "We need to talk to you," Finn said, his voice low and tight. He walked right up to the bed. Jed hung back, feeling like an intruder. Ilara looked up, her expression serene. "Finn, Jedediah, have you come to share in Cale's glorious decision?" "We've come to stop you from filling a sick man's head with poison," Finn snapped. Cale's smile faded. He coughed a deep rattling sound. "It's my choice," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "My choice. My life, it's almost over. It has meant nothing. This gives it meaning." "Meaning?" Finn's voice rose. "You think some cosmic horror that eats stars gives a damn about your meaning? It's a monster, Cale. It's manipulating you." "It is not a monster," Ilara said calmly. "It is a power beyond our understanding. It has offered us a covenant. Cale is brave enough to accept it." "This isn't bravery," Jed said, finally finding his voice. It felt thick in his throat. "It's despair." The message said it had to be hope. "You are just dressing up his despair and calling it hope." Cale looked at Jed, his pale eyes searching. "You've lost someone, haven't you, son? I can see it in your eyes, the same empty space I feel in my chest." Jed flinched as if struck. "Don't you want them back?" Cale whispered. Don't you want a chance, no matter how small? Jed thought of Sarah's face in the dream. Give them a gift, Jed. This is wrong, Jed said, but his voice lacked conviction. The moral lines were so blurry they were starting to disappear. Was it their right to take this choice away from Kale? To tell a dying man that his final wish was based on a delusion? Who were they to deny him his glorious purpose? The ceremony will be tomorrow at the primary solar cycle, Ilara announced, standing up. She looked from Finn to Jed, her gaze lingering on Jed for a second too long. You are welcome to bear witness to a true act of faith. Kale will become the savior of billions. She and her followers left. Finn stood there, shaking with a silent rage. Kale lay back on his pillows, his eyes closed, that serene, unsettling smile back on his face. He was at peace. Jed felt a new kind of terror. Not the terror of the void or the whisper, but the terror of seeing madness look so much like salvation. The night before Kale's ceremony, the universe screamed again. Jed was in the Sarah Jane's cockpit, unable to sleep. Staring out at the starfield, he was running simulations for the Rigel Hall, trying to lose himself in the familiar math of fuel consumption and gravitational slingshots. It wasn't working. His mind kept returning to Kale's face, to the awful peace in the old man's eyes. Then the alert klaxon on the station blared, a jarring, frantic sound that cut through the ship's hull. It wasn't the fire alarm or the depressurization warning. It was the general emergency signal, the one they only used for an external threat. Jade's comm unit crackled to life. It was Finn, his voice was ragged. Jed, get to the bridge, or any place with a long-range scanner, now. Jed didn't need to. He just had to look out the viewport. Every ship in the dock was powering up its external screens. Every viewport on the station was lit up. Everyone was looking at the same patch of sky. All Hadar. It was a trinary star system. 3 brilliant blue-white stars dancing around each other in a complex, beautiful orbit. It was a navigational landmark, a celestial wonder. Every pilot knew it. And it was gone. Where 3 blazing suns had been just moments before, there was now only a black hole in the cosmos. A wound, it had happened again. No explosion, no warning. Just a quiet, instantaneous deletion. Another system, with its rocky, lifeless planets, and its scientific outposts erased from existence. The panic that followed was 1,000 times worse than the first time. Kepler negative 186 had been a tragedy. This was a pattern. This was an escalation. This was a promise of more to come. The station's internal comms erupted into a cacophony of terrified shouts and sobbing. The lights on the main concourse flickered as the station's power grid struggled to cope with the sudden surge of panicked activity. And then the message came. It appeared on Jed's main cockpit screen, overriding his navigational charts. It burned onto the public displays. It seared itself into the collective consciousness of every sentient being watching the sky. The white letters on the black background. Buddha Hunri your time, grows showed. The politeness was gone. The pretense of a covenant, of a fair trade, was stripped away. This was not an offer anymore. It was a demand. A threat from a predator that had just finished its appetizer and was looking at the main course. And the main course was them. All of them. The immediate effect on Port Nowhere was electric. The debate was over. The skepticism evaporated, burned away by the heat of pure primal terror. The Starbearers were no longer a fringe cult. They were prophets. Their insane belief system was now the only thing. that offered a sliver of a solution in a universe that had suddenly become a feeding ground. Jed saw Ilara on a station-wide broadcast, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with righteous fire. "Do you see now?" she cried, her voice ringing with vindication and fear. "Do you see the price of your doubt? We hesitated, we debated, and now Al-Hadar is gone. We cannot wait any longer. Kale's gift must be given. It must be given now." The crowd behind her roared its approval. It was no longer a congregation, it was a mob, and they were ready to make a sacrifice. The station became a pressure cooker. The scheduled time for Kale's ceremony was pushed up, set to happen as soon as the mob could organize it in the main cargo bay. Station security was overwhelmed. A handful of officers, unable to stand against a tide of hundreds of terrified people led by the unshakable certainty of the Star Bearers. Jed found Finn in the engine room of the Sarah Jane. The wiry mechanic was holding a heavy plasma cutter, his knuckles white. "They're not getting on my ship," Finn said, his voice a low growl. "I don't care what happens out there." "They're going to kill him, Finn," Jed said, his own voice sounding hollow. "They'll call it a gift, but they're going to lead that old man to his death because they're scared." "We can't stop them, Jed. Look out there. It's mass hysteria. Trying to talk sense to them now would be like trying to talk down a supernova." Jed sank onto a tool chest, burying his face in his hands. The Whisper's last message echoed in his head. "Why are hungry?" He felt a crushing wave of helplessness. The same feeling he'd had watching Sarah fade away in that sterile hospital room. Useless, powerless against a force that simply took what it wanted. "The dream," Jed said, his voice muffled by his hands. "It knew about Sarah." Finn put the plasma cutter down. "What are you talking about?" Jed looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "The thing in my dream, the Whisper. It wore her face. It used her voice. It knew my name. It knew everything. It felt personal. Like it wasn't just sending a message to the galaxy. It was sending a message to me." Finn stared at him, his usual cynical mask gone, replaced by a deep concern. "Jed, that's what these things do. They find a weakness and they push. Your grief is your weakness." "But why me?" Jed asked, his voice cracking. "I am nobody. A freighter pilot on a rusty station. Why show me?" He stood up, pacing the small engine room. "The message. A heart full of hope, not a mind full of despair. What if they're wrong? What if the Whisper doesn't want a saint? What if it wants the opposite?" A terrible thought began to form in his mind, jagged and sharp. "It feeds on loss, Finn, on grief. It showed me Sarah because my grief is pure. It's a feast for it. Kale isn't full of hope. He's full of resignation. His gift is small, thin." Jed stopped pacing and looked at his friend, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. What if the perfect sacrifice isn't someone who has nothing to lose? What if it's someone who has already lost everything? As if on cue, his personal comm chimed. It was a message from an unknown sender, a simple text. "They are gathering in Cargo Bay 7. Ilara is asking for you. She says, the Whisper has shown her a vision. She says, Kale is not the true gift. You are." A cold dread, final and absolute, washed over Jed. They weren't just looking for a saint anymore. They had found their sinner, the one whose soul was perfectly seasoned with the sorrow the Whisper craved. The Star Bearers, in their desperate search for a savior, had just identified their real target. The air in Cargo Bay 7 was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Hundreds of people were crammed between stacks of shipping containers, their faces illuminated by the harsh flickering work lights. At the center of the bay, on a raised platform, stood Elara. Beside her, looking small and confused, was the old prospector, Cale. This was supposed to be his moment, but he was no longer the center of attention. Every eye in the cavernous room turned to Jed as he and Finn pushed their way through the crowd. "Jedediah Riggs," Elara's voice boomed over a portable speaker, amplified and distorted. "You have come." Her face was ecstatic, beatific. She was a true believer who had just received her revelation. "The whisper has spoken to me. It showed me your grief. It showed me your pain. It is a pain greater than anyone's, a love for the loss that is pure and bottomless. Cale's gift would be a whisper. Yours would be a shout that could shake the heavens." The crowd murmured, a wave of understanding and awe passing through them. They weren't seeing Jed the freighter pilot. They were seeing a holy vessel, a man whose personal tragedy could become their collective salvation. "This is insane, Elara," Finn yelled, stepping in front of Jed. "You are going to sacrifice him based on a dream you had." "It was not a dream. It was a commandment," she shrieked, her composure cracking. "Al-Hadar is gone because we offered it an unworthy gift. We cannot make that mistake again. His soul is the price. His sorrow is the currency." She pointed a trembling finger at Jed. "Think of your wife, Jedediah. Think of Sarah. Your gift would not just be for the billions in Kepler -186. It would be for her. A final, perfect act of love." And in that moment, hearing Sarah's name from her lips, something in Jed snapped. It wasn't logic. It was a sudden, blinding clarity. The dream, the whispers, the escalating demands. It wasn't a god demanding tribute. It wasn't a transaction. It was a hunt. The whisper didn't eat stars. It didn't eat souls. It ate the emotions the events created. It ate the terror of a vanished star. It ate the desperate, twisted hope of the sacrifice itself. It ate the crushing grief and despair of the survivors. It wasn't a deity. It was a parasite, a cosmic vampire that created its own feeding ground by dangling an impossible cure in front of a terminal patient. The sacrifice wasn't the price. The sacrifice, and all the emotion surrounding it, was the meal. "No," Jed said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. He pushed past Finn and walked toward the platform. The crowd parted before him. He looked at Elara, at the desperate faces in the mob, at the confused old man who was ready to die. "You are wrong," Jed said, his voice getting stronger. "All of you, you think this is about a trade. You think you can bargain with it." He grabbed the portable speaker from a startled starbearer and held it up. His voice echoed through the bay, raw and powerful. "It's feeding us," he shouted. "Don't you see? It's not hungry for souls. It's hungry for this." He swept his arm around, indicating the terrified crowd, the religious fervor, the desperate hope. "It eats our fear. It drinks our despair. It dangled Kepler -186 to make us afraid. It dangled the idea of a sacrifice to make us hope. It took Al-Hadar to make us desperate. It doesn't want a gift. It wants us to tear ourselves apart in the giving. Every prayer you offer, every tear you shed, you are feeding the monster." A stunned silence fell over the cargo bay. Elara stared at him, her certainty faltering for the first time. "My grief is not its currency," Jed said, his voice dropping to an intense, personal level that still carried through the speaker. My love for my wife is not its to take, and none of our lives are its to bargain with. He looked out at the sea of faces. The only way to win is not to play. The only way to starve it is to stop being afraid, to stop hoping for its miracle, to look at that empty space in the sky and choose to live anyway. He dropped the speaker. It clattered on the metal deck. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of terror or reverence. It was the silence of dawning, horrifying doubt. The simple, awful logic of his words began to sink in. They had been nurturing the thing that was killing them. The mob began to break apart, not in a rush, but in a slow, dazed dissolution. People looked at each other, then at their hands, as if seeing the madness in them for the first time. Alara stood frozen on the platform, her perfect faith shattered into a million pieces. Jed didn't know if he had saved them. He had stopped this one sacrifice on this one station. But the idea was out there now. The whisper was still out there, silent and waiting. The belief in sacrifice, once born, would not die easily. It would fester in the dark corners of the galaxy, a new and terrible religion for the desperate and the lost. He had won the battle, but the war had just begun. The universe was no longer a place of empty space and cold physics. It was a place with monsters, and the worst monsters were the ones that teach you how to feed them.